intelligence. So you might have heard me use this phrase last time we got together, which is you cannot give someone something you do not have. It's very difficult to give empathy to somebody if you yourself don't have empathy for yourself. It's very difficult to give courage to somebody if you yourself don't have courage. Very difficult to give resilience to somebody if you yourself don't have resilience in the first place. You know, the amount of times I've heard people shout at somebody saying, "You need to stay calm." I'm going, whoa, it doesn't sound like you're calm yourself. So we're going to have an exploration a little while, just for the next 10 minutes or so, a look at you. I think the starting point for emotional intelligence, for those of you that are familiar with the concept, is self-awareness. So where do you need to be on this curve? And how do you need to manage yourself on this curve in order to be able to manage everybody else? So a quick expression of emotional intelligence. As I said, this is as a topic, it's been around for 20 years or plus. It was popularized by Daniel Goleman. If you Google search Daniel Goleman, you'll have a whole series of books written by Daniel Goleman, #1 bestseller around emotional intelligence. And he helped to codify or help us to process what emotional intelligence was. The output of which was that emotional intelligence and the competencies of emotional intelligence were better indicators of performance than IQ. EQ was a better indicator of performance than IQ. I think we all know those people who have got super IQ, massive intelligence, but very low emotional intelligence. They really don't understand themselves. They don't understand others, and they don't really understand the impact that they're having on other people. Equally, we know people who maybe not quite as intelligent, but they're able to engage with people better. They're able to motivate people better. They're able to understand how their language and how their own behavior impacts on everybody else. And therefore, they're able to drive that organization's performance better than the super intelligent person. So EQ is defined as the ability to identify, assess, and control one's own emotions, but also to be able to identify those emotions of others and that of groups, so that ultimately you can have a positive impact on those groups in order to drive productivity and performance. There are 4 main components to it. Self-awareness. It starts with knowing your own emotions, knowing your own strengths and weaknesses, knowing your own drivers and values and goals, and recognizing those drivers and how they show up in your behavior and how that behavior begins to impact on others. Once we have that self-awareness, then we can control that. There's a phrase that a colleague of mine uses, which is, the things that I'm aware of, I can control. The things that I'm not aware of control me. So with self-awareness, I have self-management and self-control. So self-management, manage or redirect one's disruptive emotions. So if I've got anger, frustration, how do I redirect that into passion and determination? So manage or redirect one's disruptive emotions and impulses and adapt to changing circumstances. Then we look at others around us, and social awareness, the main competency of which is empathy, is how do we recognize and understand and consider other people's feelings, especially when we're making decisions during that change curve. And then if we've got that social awareness, if we've got that self-awareness and self-management, then we can begin to manage relationships. That's the social skill. How do we manage and influence other people's emotions so that we can move in the desired direction along that change curve? So the headline description of emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman produced this graphical model. You will notice that all of the arrows ultimately end up in the bottom right-hand quadrant, which is relationship management or relationship awareness, and ultimately having a positive impact on others. I could extend that sentence a little bit to having a positive impact on others during the change curve, and especially during the change curve. But you'll notice that all arrows end in that quadrant, but all arrows actually start in the top left-hand quadrant, which is self-awareness. Hence why I want to start on self-awareness. Where do we start? We need to start with ourselves. So quick 5 or 10 minutes on ourselves, and then we'll get into the 4 C's. So we know that during change and during disruption, we know that we're disrupting patterns of behavior, comfortable patterns of behavior. And when we introduce discomfort, and when we introduce something new or something that changes, it can produce cortisol, and cortisol can lead to sustained stress. Why is this important? There's a recent piece of research conducted by McKinsey that took a look at, and they've conducted this research over a number of years, that looked at Generation Zs and Millennials. And by way of a reminder, Generation Zs and Millennials is everybody from the age of 15, the lowest age of Gen Zs, all the way up to 38, 39 years old, which is the Millennials, right? So they're not young anymore. They are the heartbeat of most organizations and most levels of productivity. And in their study, they're asking the question, how much time do you spend stressed? And it's important to understand the answer to that question. And right now, 40% of millennials and 50% of Gen Zs spend most or all of their time stressed. Just think about that statistic for a moment. They're spending all or most of their time in a stressed state. So that isn't just an acute phase of stress introduced by change. Half of them are stressed all of the time and then introduce a change agenda or a disruption agenda, and the stress goes through the roof. That's really important to understand, because when you are full of cortisol and you're in a sustained level of stress, you've activated what's called the sympathetic nervous system, which is ironic because it's not sympathetic at all. And that sympathetic nervous system fills your body with hormones that are essentially at the bottom part of the brain, all talking about fight or flight, all talking about taking things out of proportion, you're catastrophizing about things. So if people are already stressed before you introduce COVID or introduce change, then we need to understand that as leaders to help them manage that through the change curve. If your own personal cortisol levels are through the roof and you can't switch it off, then we need to find strategies to override that cortisol level and turn on what is called the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system is super helpful. So we're going to talk about the parasympathetic nervous system and things that you can do to turn that on so that it overrides the sympathetic nervous system. And it's important because without it, you will have a weakened immune system, you'll increase your blood pressure, it will decrease motivation, reduce the ability to focus, and those are some of the things that you will need to help take other people through the change curve. So for me, I just wanted to share this one particular model that I think pretty much sums up self-awareness and self-management. So the E+R=O equation stands for E for events, triggers, change, whatever they might be. And they may be as big as something global like COVID, or as small as something like your computer crashing. Events, triggers that are disrupting your normal pattern of thinking and feeling. The R stands for your response. The O stands for your outcome. And typically this equation runs like E+R=O. So events happen, I respond, and an outcome is created. I would argue that that's not always the case. And indeed, there is a space between the E and the R. And in that space between the event and the R, I can actually choose to respond differently. If I can turn on my parasympathetic nervous system, if I can apply some strategies of emotional intelligent leadership, I can actually choose a different, more emotional response. And arguably, that emotionally intelligent response shouldn't be in the context of the event. It should be in the context of the desired outcome. So given the event, what is my desired outcome? And if I focus on the outcome, I can choose a more emotionally intelligent response, one that turns on the parasympathetic nervous system that will move me towards the outcome. So rather than have a mindset of E+R=O, I'd like people to have a mindset of events will happen. What's the O? What's the desired outcome? And choose the response. And for that, we're going to insert the F word. And the F word is fascinating. And I think it's beholden upon leaders to be fascinated when events happen and to be curious about different responses. If we can be curious and ask some questions when the events happen, we're more likely to choose. When you're asking questions, by the way, you're using your logical brain. And in the process of asking lots of questions, you're reducing the effect of the middle brain and the reptilian brain. And as a consequence, you're operating way more logically. So if between the event and the response, you get fascinated, you get curious, you get specifically curious about the outcome, you're more likely to choose a resourceful, helpful response to any event. So strategy number one is whenever you get triggered by change, whenever you get triggered by the computer crashing or the Wi-Fi failing or any trigger that is disrupting you, then I'd get fascinated before you respond. So I think one of the critical elements of emotional intelligence is both understanding what some of those triggers are. What are the classic triggers in my day, my week, my month, my year that make me respond in an unhealthy way, that make me respond in a non-emotionally intelligent way, that make me shout, that make me sulk, that make me become bored, miserable, tired, worried, nervous, anxious, apprehensive, and subsequently show up in unhealthy behaviors. So if you understand what those triggers are, you've got the self-awareness. If you then get fascinated about the triggers and you can choose your response, then you've got self-management. So self-awareness plus self-management. And when you've got to that point, you're in a better position to lead your team. If you're not self-aware of the triggers, then you'll struggle to have self-management in your response, and any behavior will show up. And that behavior isn't always helpful to yourself.